All right, let's get started. Hello. Here, let me do this. Hello there. My name's Jon Galloway. I love .NET and I love open source. Not necessarily always just .NET open source, just open source in general. My favorite kind of applications are usually like Inkscape and GIMP, and I'm always looking for the latest release of Audacity and whatever. So it was really kind of stunning and exciting and all these things when I was asked to become the executive director of the Dotnet Foundation earlier this year. I think it was March. And one of the first problems that came up was answering to my mom, to my coworkers, to whoever in general, what exactly is the Dotnet Foundation? So I took a step back and I thought, we're an advanced modern civilization and we have ways of communicating complex concepts. So I went to Giphy to look for an animated GIF to be able to explain, what exactly that is. And it was pretty clear. It was pretty clear on exactly, what the overall feeling is of open source software foundations. So, fine, take a step back. Let's go to a more authoritative source. And I asked a professor I know. And Professor Wikipedia said a lot of words. And like a lot of Wikipedia things, the words are all technically correct, but unhelpful. Like, if you already know what the thing is, and you read the words, and you say, those are good words. But if you don't know what the thing is, and you read the words, you say, umbrella organization, funding of, and then you're back to this. So what is an open source software foundation? And I'm actually going to leave you with a bit of a cliffhanger here. We'll talk about some other things, and we'll circle back, because I want to give some background on what actually is professional, mature open source development. And then I think we'll be able to kind of loop back and say, what is an open source software foundation? So I'm going to spice things up, moving from talking about foundations to talking about maturity models. Because that's going to get you, on the edge of your seat. But actually, I had this talk pretty much ready to go, which was early for me, like a couple of weeks ago, and I went to .NET Fringe up in Portland. Was anyone else there? Anyone here at .NET Fringe? So I could lie to you. I could say anything. You wouldn't know. You weren't there. But the first talk of the day was by Sean Killeen, and he gave a talk on casting a wider .NET. And it said a lot of the things that I wanted to say, and it was organized in a really cool way. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to git merge this. And so I'm pulling that in. So talking about the overall idea is, how does an organization, how does a person, but specifically, how does an organization move to adopting open source? And you generally start with a fear, uncertainty, and doubt phase, where you kind of avoid it and hope it'll go away. Then to a kind of grudging acceptance, and then finally consuming open source, not really collaborating, but consuming. And then later moving to contribution, deeper participation, and finally embracing it as a culture. So, just the general steps on this fear, uncertainty, and doubt phase. I remember trying to use a library for something that was not worth writing our own code for. This was a while ago. I was at a financial company, and I said, hey, this is a great library. Let's pull this in. I think it was reporting or charts or something. And I remember the lead on the team said, oh, that's some of that open source blogger malware stuff, huh? Yeah, let's not use that. And it was really frustrating, but I think culturally that's where a lot of it was. There's concerns about security. How do I know this? How can I trust this code? There's also confusion over what are the legal implications? What do all these licenses mean? There is a desire to reinvent the wheel, maybe because it's fun or just because you're comfortable with it. And there's often a kind of an assumption that we know our business model, we know what we're doing here, it's a known quantity, and so we're going to stick with writing our own code. Eventually, you move into an acceptance phase, hopefully, where it all kinds of work, but you don't really know how it works, right? It's some magic's happening, and out of the machine comes some open source. And you're generally kind of learning some moves here. You're trying to figure out, okay, what is a how do I file an issue, what is a pull request, that kind of thing. Then you go into consuming, so using packages, sometimes a lot more packages than you think. Restore the entire internet when you bring up your project, but that is a consuming phase. And when I talk to people and I say, are you using open source software? And the answer is almost always whether they know it, yes. Almost any, file new project in Visual Studio for a long time has pulled in a lot of packages. In most software at some point you're using some open source, right? There's also at this phase, you're starting to understand the ecosystem a little bit. There's an idea of like there's distributions and there's this source code hosting and how things work and that kind of stuff. There's still kind of a magical, like something is happening and I'm not sure how it all works. You are moving towards figuring out how to responsibly consume, meaning if something's wrong, you don't just flame, you don't maybe send an email, you post an issue, you try and help debug it. Then you move into a contribution phase where you're hopefully sending pull requests and you're seeing open source as a two-way street. You are receiving value and you're contributing value. And then you move into participation, where you are really, as a organization, you are participating in the production of that open source software. And things like your business actually incentivizing and not grudgingly allowing you to work on open source, but seeing the value in it and encouraging it, right? And then you move into a phase of cultural embrace, where you are kind of open source by default. So rather than always having to ask permission, rather than having to fight with people to do things open source, it's assumed, why wouldn't we do this open source, right? So this is this kind of this progression. So, where are you at on this scale? When you look at where you're at in your work, and also just in your mindset when you are working on your own project? Do you write your own code? Are you, worried about using other people's code, et cetera? And I take rude questions, by the way, as I go. I see we have some plants in the audience. So this came from this talk, castawider.net. So it's awider.net. Actually, pop over to that real quick. Right, so that's here. And there's kind of a deeper explaining what these phases are, but also digging into what do I do if I am having a problem with something. Like, for instance, if I don't know my licenses, there's some links here to choose a license or TLDR legal. So these are resources where you can say, gee, I don't know, boss, can I use an MIT license? What does that even mean, right? And then I can go in and get some, now this is not full-on legal advice, but this will help guide me towards, how these licenses work together, right? So that's out here at awider.net, and of course it is on GitHub, and you can, contribute pull requests to it, and so, but the idea is this is a place to continue that discussion. So let's look at some examples, and I'm going to start with one. The slides that you just saw, awider.net, because I actually had some things I liked better about my model, or at least was more familiar with. I had gone through and I'd spent time on it. I was comfortable with it, and I was trying to merge parts of Sean's, model and his talk in with mine. And then I thought, this is so contradictory of the principles that I'm talking about, right? It clubbed me on the head. I'm like, this is exactly the thing. Instead of not invented here, come up with my own thing, try and make mine the canonical thing, whatever, why don't we contribute to the same place? Why don't we point to the same thing? So that was kind of a light bulb moment for me. Another kind of, bigger example is Microsoft's journey in general into open source. So if you look at it, starting with, there was long ago some source open, even going back to Rotor, which was, hey, here's .NET, here's some source code, you can look at it, you can't use it, you can, in fact, maybe you shouldn't look at it because it may taint you, so, but there it is, there's some source code, so thanks for that. Then going on to some things like open design notes, where we're at least talking in public about here's what we're thinking of, right? Designing in public. Then going to source open with some limited contributions. And I'm thinking of some things back on, like for instance, the MVC and Web API source code out on Codeplex. There were some places where the community would say like, hey, your routing in MVC, kind of a pain. A lot of people are using attribute routing. Tim, I forget his last name, his library, and let's see about using that. And so then there were emails and months of communication and back and forth, and some components and some parts of attribute routing end up in MVC and Web API a few years ago. So it's limited, but it's very controlled and constrained, the kind of contributions. Moving to a full open source workflow. So my experience with this was watching .NET Core, back when it was Project K, being built on GitHub. And I actually saw, we all love David Fowler. David Fowler is my I'm up too late alarm. So, meaning, David Fowler stays up all night, and if I'm working and it's 1:30 or 2 in the morning, and I get a chat from David Fowler, and it's like, hey dude, check this out, then I'm like, oh no, tomorrow morning's gonna suck, because this means I'm up way too late, and then pretty soon the roosters start crowing and stuff. But he would send me stuff, and he would be working, on crazy experiments with Project K, which became DNX, which became ASP.NET Core. And from the beginning, they were working in GitHub repos. And as soon as they kind of got the permission and were like, yeah, this is kind of in an okay state, boom, it's, these are live repositories, and they're full open repositories, right? So I don't have to, for those that haven't seen, if I go to, right, so here's Kestrel HTTP server. If you look at the commits, you can see the commits as they're happening. So, you can go in and you can watch, okay, 11 hours ago since the last commit, so you guys are slacking a bit. This is actually the real repo. There's not some kind of magical behind-the-scenes repo. And usually when I show this to people now, they're like, duh, yeah, we all know this. It actually, for a long time, was like everyone assumed that there were secret behind-the-scenes repos, because that was kind of the Microsoft way of doing open source for a while, right? And then, of course, if you look at the committers, you'll see number 2 is Ben Adams, who is not a Microsoft employee, right, and who is contributing to the project. Some of the most exciting parts. Moving from that to documentation. So actual, putting the documentation so it's open source on GitHub as well. So I can go in and I can edit and change the documentation. And finally, moving towards shared ownership, meaning we actually work together to set the direction of the project. We figure out what's the roadmap. We discuss the roadmap. We don't just say, hey, community, what would you like? Go out to user voice, and then we look and pick and choose. We actually should be working together to form the direction of where we want to go. So an example here of this kind of looking at Microsoft's kind of movement here is what Microsoft has done with Git. And so there was so Microsoft has had its own source code for all the Microsoft stuff, right? Including, whatever, Xbox, Windows, Office, including .NET and stuff. It's been in a variety of repos. There's been some that have been in Team System, but a good amount have stayed in Source Depot, which is Microsoft internal. And they ran into some scaling issues and some things where they couldn't collaborate well. And so they said, hey, why don't we put this all into Git? So it sounds neat. There's this libgit2 library, which is an open source, not Microsoft project. And looking at that, they said, yeah, we can use this, but there's some things in here. There's no support for the kind of merge we need to do and stuff like that. So the idea here was like, hey, let's contribute to this instead of building our own kind of thing. And they also worked on as well with this Git virtual file system. So the results of Git virtual file system are now being able to do some things that were really prohibitive before. There's some things that seem like they shouldn't be a big deal, but builds even a checkout of the source code for Windows could take hours. A build could take, forget about it, like a whole weekend, right? So some pretty positive things out of this. And this is a big repo. This is significantly bigger than the kind of repos that most people are working with. So the end result here, surprisingly, is that whereas GitHub is the largest Git hosting provider, Microsoft actually has the biggest Git repositories. So the result that I kind of want to narrow in on with this is that as a result of working together in an open source way, Microsoft embracing the kind of mature way of working with open source here, they saw, hey, here's some things we need, and we're able to contribute this back, and Git virtual file system is, is open source and is available for everyone to use. Right? So another example, .NET Core. So a lot of examples of this, but one just simple one is by opening up .NET Core. Even in 2015, you see all these worldwide contribution, and then growing to 2017, it's kind of contribution from all over the world. Okay, so let's kind of come back to .NET Foundation, where the cliffhanger comes to an end here. So narrowing in on what is the .NET Foundation. There are actually, on the .NET Foundation site, some relatively helpful words. So there's some things, and I'll carefully, actually, let's stand here. There's some things like, there's supposed to be lasers. I was told there would be laser. Oh, well. It's an independent organization, so that's a key thing. The .NET Foundation is not owned by Microsoft. It's a 501c6 nonprofit, right? So it is not a Microsoft thing. It's an independent organization. So built for collaboration. Collaboration between community and commercial developers. So that's a key thing we'll look at. And things about openness and community participation. So, I think I killed, let me see if it comes back on. Otherwise I'll have to switch. I'd have to switch to John's keylogger.
That has a laser.
This does have a laser? Yes. Where is the, there's this. It has a bigger receiver too. Everything about this is better. Look at that. Okay, so from looking at this thing, let's go back and look at things that it's not, which people kind of commonly misunderstand. It's not primarily marketing. It's not really a marketing organization, and that's good, right? Because the .NET team already has a marketing organization. There's some pretty good marketing people. If you look at other open source software foundations, those that are supported by larger companies, they have marketing organizations too, right? So there's no need for yet another marketing organization. There's also, who here does not know what the word ombudsman means? Okay, so the last time I talked, a bunch of people were like, what's an ombudsman? So, but now I'm in Europe and people won't do that. People will not talk while I'm talking, but this was in Portland. So the idea is an ombudsman is someone you talk to when something's messed up, right? So it's kind of a back channel, somebody you can talk to and say, hey, I'm having some problems here. Can you take a look at this? Can you get to the bottom of this, right? And .NET Foundation, there's definitely parts of that. Several people in this room I've had, direct message conversations with, trying to figure stuff out and saying, hey, this is messed up. Let's get this fixed. But that's not the sole purpose. That's kind of an outgrowth of some other things that an open source software foundation is. All right, so what were the problems that we actually, built .NET Foundation to do? So one is, from that definition earlier, it's to allow for community and commercial contribution. So working together in the same place, the community, or commercial and community working together. So if you look at, who the technical steering group is, we have at least John there from Google. We have several people from, I don't know who else is actually here in person, but we have, representatives from these different companies here. So the technical steering group is actually, helps provide the technical direction of where .NET goes. Going to a bigger than Microsoft .NET, right? So some things, some values there. One is trust. And the idea is that Microsoft makes mistakes pretty regularly. We all make mistakes, right? And so having .NET be bigger than Microsoft hopefully gives me some kind of trust in the longer term direction and what's going on with .NET. So .NET is very clearly in Microsoft's future interest. Microsoft needs .NET for so many things that it ships, But even if Microsoft said, yeah, we're done with .NET, it's all plastics or whatever, it's all 3D holograms now, the .NET Foundation stays around, and .NET stays around because of the licenses and because of the way it's set up. So, and some of that is this shared ownership. So actually, so there are a lot of engineers at Microsoft that are daily checking in code to all these GitHub repos for .NET. There are people here in this audience, there are people throughout the community, they're also checking in code. Regardless of whoever checks that code in, it says copyright .NET Foundation. So when a Microsoft employee checks in that code, it will actually, the copyright notice on that says copyright .NET Foundation. That code has been contributed to the .NET Foundation. So we're all sharing that code together because it's all owned by this one foundation, right? And then there's also this thing of governance. And so the idea with governance is that you have a shared set of rules. So I'm going to GitHub/.net. I almost said got.net. Anyone remember that? Yeah, good times. So if we go to GitHub.net home, so there's some things in here where we spell out what exactly, jumping the gun there. There's some things on how does governance work? What are the bylaws? How is it kind of set up? So the idea, and this should grow over time, right? Because what we're trying to do is spell out, it's not just some people off in Microsoft and some boardrooms making decisions. This is a community discussion of where we're going and how we figure things out. So as an example of this, I mentioned when you check code in or when I check code in, this code is reviewed by this .NET bot who will see, has this GitHub user signed a contributor license agreement? And that happens for anyone. It happens for you, it happens for Microsoft employee regardless. And once they do, then the bot says, yes, you've signed the CLA. Okay, great, that code is contributed to .NET Foundation. Now it's funny, this .NET bot actually, originally it was just a GitHub user called .NET bot. And then everyone kept seeing it pop up on there, and we created this cute little robot. And it's actually pretty active on GitHub because it's continually doing things and reviewing things and stuff. It's actually so active on GitHub that it's started to get recruiters interested. So the .NET bot has a bright future, I'm sure. But okay, so that's the first and I think kind of the more obvious thing of what does a foundation do? This is Microsoft, this is Google, this is Samsung, this is Red Hat, this is all these different contributors working together as companies, and then people in the community, Ben Adams, you, me, well, okay. But the community checking code in as well, right? This is shared ownership. But another thing that the .NET Foundation does, it exists to support the entire .NET ecosystem, right? So from this point of view, there are community contributed projects. So there are some like, I'll give you an example, NancyFX, right? Or Cake Build, right? There's a lot of other ones. Well, there's a slide coming up with a ton of them, right? But the idea is that community projects can join the .NET Foundation. And when you look at this, like the more you kind of think about it, why not? Why aren't they why is a project that you make in your spare time that's contributed to the .NET Foundation any less valid, any different than a project that Joe engineer at Microsoft creates, right? It's the same thing. When you look at it from the point of view of a separate foundation whose goal is just to support .NET open source. So some things that it can do, foundation. One is sponsorship. And, like this sponsorship here really doesn't mean money. It's not like, hey, we'll pay. Now, it could. The foundation does not have a huge budget. Usually, when you want huge budgets, you do talk to marketing people, and unfortunately, we're not marketing. But as far as sponsorship, there are other things like, hey, we need a build server. Hey, we need a code signing certificate. Hey, we'd really, someone on our team needs software licenses, needs an MSDN license. So those are some things where routinely we're providing from the .NET Foundation. Another thing is governance. So I showed you that thing on the .NET repository here, here's some of the kind of governance things that we've spelled out. If another project wants to join the .NET Foundation, there's a thing we have in here where it is, actually, is it guidance? New projects. So this is kind of a checklist for projects as they join the .NET Foundation. And there's some things, that, including like a little handy markdown checklist. So some projects will actually just create a pull request and include this. And in case you didn't know, if you use that markdown, it actually creates a checklist in a GitHub issue, right? Which is kind of easy. So, but the idea is some things like, hey, do you have your license spelled out? Do you have a code of conduct? Do you have things, that make it easy for a contributor to get involved? I'll tell you what I think is probably one of the most important one or two things is, how does a new member become a contributor? How do they actually go from someone who's submitting pull requests to someone who's approving pull requests? How do they go to being a project owner when the original project owner leaves? And I don't know how many of you have, this has happened to me so many times where I've got a problem, I search around, I find an open source library, it looks awesome, and the latest commit was 2 years ago, and there's a ton of unmerged pull requests and open issues, right? Sad, sad, sad trombone. It's the saddest thing. And so this is a place where governance and longevity is something that a foundation can do, because for projects joining .NET Foundation, there's actually a DNF admin account, GitHub account, where we join your repository as a maintainer, and we're able to, we spell out, here's what happens, here's how succession works, here's how new people can join, and say you're like, you know what, I'm done with this. This other, someone else says, hey, I would like to take over. That stuff's all spelled out. Most projects, people have good intentions, but they don't think about this stuff, right? You're thinking about hacking code, maybe shipping a release, fixing some bugs. And so then when you move on to another project, you stop working on this one, none of that stuff's spelled out, right? So this really is a key important thing, is to keep the projects alive, keep projects thriving by spelling out the ways that new people can become involved. So I talked this over with Scott Hanselman, and he's like, oh, you got to do the pizza as a service thing. So I think it mostly fits. I'm still kind of figuring it out. But you've seen this whole service approach thing, right? A way of going from like IaaS to PaaS or whatever. This is pizza as a service. So we go from, pizza made at home, where you're doing everything. You're responsible for the whole stack, right? Do I have laser? I have laser, right? So this is your pizza from scratch. Going to, well, I actually bought my pizza at the store. I don't tell my kids. I just go and pop it in the oven, right? But we still have to set the table and get out the drinks, right? Going up to delivery, where we just order it out and they come to the house. And who here has seen, by the way, no sauce, left sausage? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? You can go through and you can order left sausage, none pizza with left sausage. This is, we definitely need to look into this. None pizza with left beef, that's the problem. That's why you didn't know what I was talking about. So you can go through and you can say what you'd like on your pizza, right? So let's look at that. This actually, there's no way I'll be able to tie this in. But somebody realized on this form that you could say I would like no sauce or cheese and I would like beef only on the left side. And so then there's a whole thing where tons of people dress as none pizza with left beef for Halloween. So anyways, that is an issue you would encounter if you were ordering out pizza. And then finally you go to going to the restaurant, where you just show up and pay, right? So looking at something like this, what if we were doing an open source project and we wanted to apply some of this model? You could go from just you hacking on your own. So you are writing the code, you're fixing the bugs, you are doing the publicity, the blog posts, and all that kind of stuff. You're dealing with legal and governance. Hopefully that's just picking your license when you set up the project. But you also are having to deal with, do we have a code of conduct? How do we deal with someone that's abusive? How do we deal with succession for my project? All that kind of stuff. We have things like setting up a build. How do we actually create a release? Is it me on my laptop? Probably. Security. Do we do code signing? Do we do, security analysis? How do we handle the security of the thing? And then finally, there's the paying of expenses. So whenever I need to, host a new site, when I need to buy a new cert, when I need to do anything, it's always my credit card comes out, right? So now I bring a friend onto the project, and I've got a team project. So now I've changed from, I should have made the one on the left blue, because that's kind of sad, but anyhow, it's a different color. This is a team ownership of this, right? We're writing the code together, we're fixing the bugs together, we're doing publicity, guidance, governance, build servers, security, and paying expenses, but we're responsible for all of it. Moving to, say, like a sponsored project. So this is a project where I am working under the sponsorship, or somehow I'm being paid by a company. Maybe it's my work is sponsoring that project. So I'm still writing the code and fixing bugs, still probably doing the publicity and legal governance. Maybe, I don't know, maybe my work can chip in. But they're providing the build server, security, and paying expenses. What we want to get to, though, what could we do if we've got tons of different open source .NET projects with 2 or 3 people working on them, but they all have the same cross-cutting concerns? How could we kind of pool that all together and make some poor guy administer all that for your project, right? So instead, you're just writing the code and fixing the bugs, and then we're handling all this other stuff for you. And you still have the kind of control over it. You have the ability to say, hey, we need this, or I'm going to write my own blog post when we need. But, we can kind of help with that. So this is kind of a loosey-goosey sort of thing. There's tons of different things that go into different projects, but this is the overall kind of idea, is moving from you're really responsible for writing the code for your project, the stuff you love doing, and the foundation that's supporting you is doing this other stuff. I should take a step back for a second here and say, it's not just the .NET Foundation. There's a lot of other open source software foundations out there. Like Apache comes to mind, Linux, there's several other open source software foundations. Really, honestly, for the most part, I don't care. Like if your project fits under a software foundation that's going to support you, keep your project healthy, go for it. Like we have talked recently to projects that wanted to join, and we're like, hey, you know what? You might fit into this other foundation. That might work better for you. So the idea really is let 1,000 flowers bloom, have 1,000 happy open source projects, but have an open source foundation supporting you, right? Yes?
Is it worth pointing out one other advantage of the foundation from the consumer's point of view is that I now have more confidence that the project's not going to vanish overnight.
Absolutely. Let's add that slide. I'm serious. We need this project. Well, okay, so actually I would say something more like project trust in project. So there is both the project won't vanish. I'm thinking here of the Abraham Lincoln when they did the Gettysburg Address in PowerPoint, and they did like nation not fail, but so project not vanish. But another thing is I can sell easier to sell to boss, right? So endorsement. I guess since I mentioned it, I have to pop over to that.
Yeah, right, because you're moving away from the problem you discussed earlier, which is it's some blogger hacker, right?
Right, exactly. So, and I've talked to people lately where they said like they are .NET Foundation members, and they said that yeah, well, whatever. Right, so this is the Gettysburg Nation not fail. They said that the biggest advantage that they got out of the .NET Foundation was that they were able to go into, banks and say, hey, we are a .NET Foundation project. We are supported by a foundation. So great point. So thank you. Does that make sense to everybody? The idea here of you are a part of a bigger thing. It's on paper, and so the community can trust your project more. Yeah.
I agree to some extent, but I'm interested to what extent the .NET Foundation is actively endorsing, saying we think this is a good project that will fit your thing, and the best way of addressing this problem, which is risky.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a good point. And to repeat for people that couldn't hear, John was saying does this endorsement mean this is a good project with great code that will work in your project, right? Is this library something that's going to work in all? And I think that's not something we can say, right? Even if it's the world's even if Nota Time is the world's best time library, it may not work in whatever it is. It's debatable. It is not debatable. But
is that what the bank is hearing, and why they're willing?
Well, it shouldn't be, and I don't know if we need to spell that out, but I think the thing is more that it is not a Bob and Jane and Steve project. It is a .NET Foundation project. You know what I mean? So in terms of going and talking to a bank, going and talking to your boss, you can say, this is a project that is supported by, a legal entity. So I think that's kind of the idea there. So as an idea of here are projects both contributed from and from outside of Microsoft. There's actually a lot more here. It's just the slide got full. But there's some, like Cake is one that I've been interested in lately. There's Cecil. There are several actually that we're working with I can't really say it, but there are projects that are from inside of Microsoft that they're like, hey, this is something where an engineer inside of Microsoft Research built. It's a utility you know and love. You've used it probably before. And let's contribute it to the .NET Foundation, right? So that it's officially even if Microsoft loses interest, even if this guy goes and works it somewhere else, so what? This project is a bigger thing that lives on, right? Okay, so let's take a look at a few more in-depth case studies. So one is this the idea of Nougat Succession. So this is something that unfortunately, people go away from projects for different reasons. Sometimes they just lose interest. Unfortunately, sometimes people die, right? We do die. Currently, we do still die. And so what happens then? Is there something written down as far as how does someone take over this project? So Nougat is actually a .NET Foundation project. And we had someone raise this issue, and they said, hey, you have nothing spelled out here. So there was a very specific case where someone had passed away, and we needed to figure out what happens to their code and to the ownership of their Nougat package. We can do that as a one-off, right? We can go through and we can say, yeah, this makes sense, and we can verify this person's passed away and all that kind of thing. But bigger picture, to do grown-up open source, to do this the right way, let's spell out an actual policy. So this is something where, I rung up the right people. I go and talk to the project managers over on the Nougat team. I talk to the legal people in Microsoft. There's both the Microsoft legal people and the .NET Foundation legal people. And we said, let's hammer this out. Now, short segue here. I love the legal people I work with at Microsoft for open source. You would probably picture that they are just sitting there saying, no, no, no. And the time was that they did. They were really focused on minimizing risk. They wanted to say no as much as possible because they controlled the risk. Really now, I have a good amount of the times that I get pushback from the legal reps are where they're saying, why isn't this more open? Why is this controlled by Microsoft? Why is this not, you know what I mean? So they get it. And so it's really refreshing to be working with them, and there's no amount of pushback against open source at all. But so we worked on this, and we came up with a policy, right? So this policy is out. It's published on docs.microsoft.com, and it actually is, it is something where I think it's a pretty good policy. I think we're pretty happy with it being spelled out. It is something that I guarantee will probably change. Guarantee will probably. I don't know if that's good English, but it is likely to change because this is most policies should continue to get better. But a surprising thing, my first thing when they raised this issue, they said, hey, what is your policy? And I said, oh, let's cheat. Let's copy someone else's answer. I went out and I looked at the other big package repositories, and nobody seemed to have this spelled out. NPM didn't. Ruby Gems. I looked around a bunch, and I didn't find anybody having spelled this out. Maybe it was there, and I didn't see it. But so in a way, I almost felt like we were kind of blazing some trails here, and I'd like to see us do more of that. So let's look at another interesting one, and this was one where I kind of, was tougher on myself maybe than I needed to be, but I wanted to feel the pain of what is it like being an open source project? Again, I hadn't run an open source project for a little while. And so who here has used Windows Live Writer? A decent amount of people. So it is a blog editor, a blog post editor, right? I loved it. I wrote so many posts using that. It's great because it handles a lot of formatting things. It lets you get down into the source code and you can go and tweak things. A few years ago, it was open sourced as Open Live Writer. So this was the result of a lot of people working together and getting permission to open source something. Little segue there, it's a lot harder to open source something if you don't start from the beginning. I have had several projects I've worked on at Microsoft, including like build keynote demos and things where it's like, hey, let's open source this. Oh yeah, let's wait till the end and then we'll do it. Never happens. It's really, really difficult. So just pointer there, if you think you might open source something, start doing it as early as possible. Even if it's doing something like checking into a private repository, but having your licenses spelled out and having a plan for we're only going to use libraries that fit into this license, et cetera. But so they open sourced Open Live Writer, but then it they got a few releases out. It's using Squirrel for doing kind of updates, and then so that was cool. And then they did a Windows 10 store version of it. So that was maybe September of last year. So that's through the magic of Centennial. I think it's a UWP Bridge or something. But the idea is you can run, so it's actually a Windows Forms application, but you can run this desktop app converter and it'll kind of suck something in and it virtualizes some business and it runs, magic happens and it runs as a store app. Cool. So the problem with that was, in order to make both things happen, we ended up with a little bit of a completely broken and ruined project, sort of, because you couldn't do a secondary store release, but it was also broken in terms of doing a desktop release. So I was kind of like, well, this is a .NET Foundation project. Let me get in and try and help. And so I took a look at things, talked to a bunch of people, and I realized what was going on was nobody knew how to do the store build. The person that had done the build was actually on the store team and had moved off and done something else. The people that... Yeah, so one thing was, in order to actually do a release, you needed to remote desktop into a virtual machine and run this script to do a build. So you needed login for this virtual machine, and then it signed the build, but the certificate was expired. So nobody could do a build. It was impossible to do a build. So we went through and we figured stuff out, and I actually worked with several people. I worked with Paul Betts, who actually builds Squirrel. And I work with Oren Novotny, who's a .NET Foundation Advisory Council member, and he helped me kind of get a secure build running. So we've got certificates and the signing service and all this stuff set up. So every code check-in creates a signed release, right? So we did a release a couple of weeks ago, and I literally took the files that were created by that signed release, copied them up to a blob storage, and the release was live. So the idea there is okay, it's a case study, that is one project. But the idea is bigger picture. Can we do this for more things? Can we document those processes? Can we figure out some ways that we can share some things? So one thing that we can share there is that code signing. So when you're releasing software, in a lot of cases, you need to do code signing so that, for instance, this is a desktop installer. We need you to be able to run the installer without smart screen popping up and saying this is untrusted and all that kind of stuff, right? So the way a lot of people do this is you download and install these certs locally and you manually run sign tool every time. I keep stepping on that light. And you manually run sign tool or you create a batch file or something, right? So we actually set things up using AppVeyor and calling into a signing service. And so that's something .NET Foundation runs, is a code signing service where you are registered with this. You have a certificate you can use to call into the service, and it will sign your binaries for you, right? So that's an example of a service that we can take, and we can go from a specific case to a general case, and we can solve a lot of problems, hopefully. So the general idea is that Unfortunately, Giphy does not allow pull requests. But if they did, I would like this to be the gift that you get when you search for Open Source Software Foundation, because the idea is, right, to keep your project going and going. So what's next? What do we do from this? Well, some things I would recommend coming out of this. One is to get involved. So there are some links I've got listed here up for grabs in your first pull request. If you have not started contributing, creating pull requests, these are good places to get involved. Another really obvious and easy place to start doing pull requests is through docs.microsoft.com. So let's take a look. If we go in here, this is Introduction to ASP.NET Core, right? If we look at this, we can say ASP.NET Core came out almost 15 years ago as part of the .NET framework. But I happen to know, because I read this blog, that .NET is more than 15 years old, right, as of February. So we can actually go into this. We can click on Edit. And now I'm going to go to click on the pencil. And we'll scroll down and we'll say, came out more than, and then I'll click down here, and I will say, updated .NET age, and I will propose file change. Okay, so now I'm ready to create a pull request. So boom, here we go. You know how some people do, like, I'm launching this live on stage. Well, I'm doing a pull request live on stage. It's so exciting, right? But so we can see here that it's going to go in, and it should, in a second, the .NET bot should pick up and say, did you sign a pull request? And then it's going to, it'll verify yes. In my case, as a Microsoft employee, I've already signed a CLA. For your case, the act of actually going and signing a CLA is incredibly simple. It's not a big deal. You click through a thing, you get a DocuSign, and you sign and you say, I'm signing that I have permission, that I am contributing my contributions, right? So I've gone through and done tons of these. Like, this is something I regularly do as I am just reading through documentation. So I recommend, here's another one that I did recently. This was on UWP. I like this as a just general practice, not just because, hey, we're making the docs better for everyone, but it's a way of, in your brain, thinking of continually doing pull requests, continually working together in community, right?
You also have 24 pull requests, around Christmas.
Yes. So here we've got, which was that system.ben? I think system.ben was later. I had a lot for that too. So then this castawider.net, this is a wider.net website. So again, if you are in the starting to get involved stage, I definitely recommend take some time and look at this. I recommend sharing this around in your company and figuring out, how do we get to the next stage? Where are we at on here, and how can we level up? Calling out to Ian Cooper's talk here from earlier this week. So the video is not live for this, but this was really, I thought, really inspiring. There's kind of a stick at the beginning. There is so who here was not at Ian's talk? Okay, highly, highly recommended. Very, very key talk, because it talks about what is the state of .NET development right now. Where are we at, right? So Ian had a blog post recently. I think it would autocomplete too. There it is. Okay, so there's really a couple of parts to this. And first of all is establishing the need, right? Why do we need a Renaissance? And so Ian does a great job of explaining what are some of the things that are causing stress and sadness in the .NET ecosystem. What are some negative pressures on the .NET ecosystem? But then I really liked in his talk where he went and said, where do we go next? What can we build? Where can the community get involved? And what I think is really important that you pointed out, Ian, is the idea that this is a problem for the community really to solve. And Microsoft can do some things to support the community, and the .NET Foundation can do some things to support the community, but this is a thing where the community really can and should own this, right, as far as how we move forward. So I'm looking forward to that video coming out. And hopefully, since it was streamed on Channel 9, it also should be out there Yeah.
Nine guys said they're going to do that as soon as they can.
Okay, cool. Excellent. So that's really all I've got. Unfortunately, it's difficult giving a talk with no code. It's hard for me to kind of plan the time because I can space things out with that. Do we have any questions? We're a little bit early. Yeah.
So, programmer plus programmer equals open source project. Project plus project equals open source foundation. Foundation plus foundation equals fill in the blank.
You know, honestly, I don't know. So what John's saying is programmer plus programmer project plus project foundation plus foundation is what? I don't know. And so I actually went to OSCON a few weeks ago and talked to some other foundations, and I was like, hey, I'm from Dotnet Foundation. I'm like, cool. You know, and it's like, okay, what do we do? You know, so I do think that there's some things where we can collaborate better. There are some, and we have done some things where, so the previous executive director of Dotnet Foundation, who is now a VP of Dotnet Foundation, he is Martin Woodward. And there are several things where I've talked to him before, and he's like, you know what, Apache also does this. Let's check with them. So we do have some kind of loose collaboration on things. There are some differences in what foundations, like, so Dotnet Foundation has .NET at its core, right? That's really like what Dotnet Foundation does, but there are some cross-cutting concerns and things. So for instance, that signing service that Oren set up that we're using to sign NuGet packages and .NET binaries, we actually did a decent amount of work with talking to a bunch of other people, talking to DigiCert, talking to the Windows team, talking to people to say, hey, can we create a generic signing service that doesn't require you even joining a foundation? Yeah, the answer is I don't really know. I do feel like that's an area we can grow in. And from my limited experience, I'm guessing that a lot of foundations are relatively strapped on time and could use some sharing of resources and expertise. So there is also, they do have some regular conferences and meetings and stuff. I have not been to one yet outside of OSCON. Other questions or comments? Yes.
I guess one of the problems with lots of open source projects is getting eyeballs on the project. I wonder,
Getting what on the project?
getting people to actually come and see your project exists, know you're actually out there,
Mm-hmm.
particularly as people are coming into OSS for the first time, understanding where they can find stuff. Have you got any thoughts about what you could do to help with those problems?
A few. So is it mostly about visibility?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, there's a few things. So Ian's asking, what can we do to help with visibility into projects? One is definitely, I do think that like .NET Foundation can try and call out publicize projects. There is, if you go to .NET Foundation on the site, there is a project lookup. It's not particularly, it's not incredibly exciting, but you can go in here and you can search for different types of projects, right? So if I search for like build, I believe we should have like cake build in here somewhere, right? We have some others. Yeah. So another thing that I think we can do more of is there's this up for grabs. So up for grabs is a kind of common thing for new people wanting to get involved. And so you can say like, I would like to work on something that has, time, right? We can find there. Note time's not on here. That's sad. But the idea here with this is, if we look at this project, here it shows there are 6 up for grabs issues. And the way that's done is these issues actually have the GitHub label up for grabs. And you'll notice when you look at these that some of these have different ways of marking theirs. Some use the up for grabs label, and that's kind of a recommended one, but there are others like Superpowers, which is new to me, uses the help wanted tag, right? Bond's an interesting one. It's like it's a serializing thing that's pretty advanced. So if you scroll through, there's tons of different ones. So this is a way of publicizing in terms of getting people involved in your project. I'm also kind of hoping this summer, and I haven't completely kicked it off or anything yet, but I'm trying to set up some things where we're actually doing some open source hackfest kind of stuff, where we're encouraging people to get involved in hacking on projects. And then, yeah, so those are some ways. I'm open to suggestions too, of course, if there are better ways. A difficulty with publicity is sometimes I don't want to make just a bunch of noise either, right? So, you know, it's important to kind of have targeted and focused and useful information. We do have, there's like Twitter, Dotnet Foundation, Dotnet FDN. So we do things on here like for member projects, right? Here's the cake team, you know, was listed on This Week in .NET. So here's another thing actually that we just launched recently. This is myself and a teammate, Maria Nagaga, and we're doing these code conversations. So these are short little interviews with open source .NET developers. The ones we've done so far, we went and recorded 25 in Channel 9 Studio because we could just line people up. But the goal really here is to have at least as many from non-Microsoft people, right? So screen sharing. And what we're doing on this is trying to go beyond here's an advertisement for a project and look more at how do I actually build something with it, right? So we have some things in here where we're talking to, like for instance, tag helpers, and we're sitting down with Taylor Mullen and saying, you know, how do we actually create a tag helper? So, totally open to any other suggestions, of course, but those are some things. Other questions, thoughts? One more? I know it's Europe, but one more person has a.
Thank you for doing it.
Well, you're welcome. You know, I have to say, it's people ask like, what do you think of this job? Do you like it and stuff? It is, in some people are like, oh, Foundation, you must hang out all day. It's like super easy and you have a huge budget, and none of those things are true. But I love it. I seriously, going back to, you know, my first original hello slide, right? I do love .NET. I do love open source, and I love to say hello. But so, you know, I mean, those are some key things. And there have been times where, you know, like, oh man, I get a little discouraged, and I'll talk to Martin, who was doing this before, and he would just say, like, you know, if you can help out a project every day, like, that's a big thing, you know. So thank you. All right, folks, thank you.